You call that a tattoo, old man? The words cut through the quiet morning air of the SEAL training compound, sharp and dripping with disbelief. Glenn Walker, 82, sat at the edge of the obstacle course, a steaming cup of black coffee in his hands, his posture relaxed but every muscle seemingly aware of the world around him. The recruits, a group of 20 young men fresh from BUD/S, clustered near the bleachers, their laughter echoing off the metal containers and concrete barriers. Jason Cole, 20, with the cocky swagger that comes from first impressions of authority, leaned over and jabbed a finger at the faded black serpent coiled around Glenn's forearm, the ink blurred by decades and sun, forming a circle with a five-pointed star at its center. Seriously, this looks like something from a cereal box, he sneered, and a ripple of snickers ran through the group. Glenn's pale blue eyes didn't shift, didn't betray irritation or amusement, just calm observation, the kind of patience that had been honed over decades of silent, exacting service. The sun glinted off the wet tarmac, making the tattoo shimmer faintly, as if inviting scrutiny. Another recruit nudged his buddy, whispering loud enough for Glenn to hear. "Do you think he actually served? Or is this some story his grandchildren told him?" The words carried the usual arrogance of youth, a sense that experience could be measured only in medals in the public eye. Glenn took a slow sip of his coffee, setting the mug down with a soft clink, the sound swallowed immediately by the hum of distant helicopters and the clatter of boots against metal stairways. The recruits pressed closer, leaning in to jeer, not noticing the slight shift in the air, the tension that had begun to coil subtly around their casual mockery. Jason smirked, stepping even nearer, his shadow falling across Glenn's weathered hand as he gestured at the tattoo. "You going to tell us what it means, or are we supposed to just pretend it's cool?" he demanded, the edge of his voice confident and cutting, meant to provoke, meant to test. Glenn's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly, as if weighing the value of words against silence. His eyes swept the group slowly, noting the fleeting expressions, the curiosity, the amusement, the challenge, and he finally spoke, his voice low and steady, almost a whisper over the morning wind. "It means more to the five of us than any medal ever could." The recruits blinked at the phrase, some leaning forward, others laughing nervously, unsure if they had missed something. Jason, feeling emboldened, reached out and lightly touched the serpentine ink, curiosity and condescension mingling in his fingers. In that instant, the world seemed to tilt ever so slightly. The hum of the compound faded, replaced by the scent of wet earth and heat, a memory blooming sharply in Glenn's mind. He remembered the nights under foreign stars, the quiet pact made between 5 men who had survived missions no one else knew existed, and the simple act of marking themselves, a circle and star, a promise inked into flesh, a symbol of trust and endurance. His fingers brushed the tattoo in return, almost reflexively, and the recruits sensed a shift, the atmosphere tightening like a drawn bowstring. The laughter that had filled the air moments ago died abruptly, replaced by a cautious silence. Even the youngest of them, their faces pale under the morning sun, felt the gravity of a presence they had dismissed too quickly. Glenn's gaze returned to his coffee, calm, unbroken, yet the spark in his eyes hinted at stories that could bend the course of a room, the kind of stories that commanded attention not through words, but through the weight of life carried quietly over decades. In the background, unnoticed at first, Petty Officer Ryan Brooks shifted slightly, observing, recognizing something in the old man's posture, in the way he held himself, a story encoded in muscle memory, in stillness, in the tattoo that the recruits had underestimated. The compound noises, the distant rotor hum, the slap of boots, the soft clang of metal gates, continued around them. But the focus had narrowed, the tension palpable, as every young man in the vicinity sensed that the morning had changed, that something unseen had just declared itself with quiet authority. Jason Cole hated being ignored. The silence from the old man bothered him more than any argument ever could. Around the training compound, confidence was currency. Recruits competed for attention, instructors demanded it, and every mistake was announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. But Glenn Walker sat there as if none of it mattered. The morning sun climbed higher above the compound, turning the steel railings warm and drawing waves of heat from the blacktop. Recruits moved between training stations while instructors barked orders across the yard. Yet the small group around the bleachers remained strangely focused on the old veteran. Jason folded his arms. "5 of us," he repeated, mocking the phrase Glenn had spoken moments earlier. "That is it. That is the big secret." Several recruits laughed. One pulled out his phone and zoomed in on the faded tattoo. The image appeared on the screen, blurry and unimpressive. A worn black serpent. A simple star. Nothing about it looked legendary. Nothing about it looked important. "I searched military unit patches for years before joining," another recruit said. "I have never seen that symbol." Jason grinned. "Because it is not real." More laughter followed. Glenn remained calm. He lifted the coffee cup again and stared toward the distant training range where a line of American flags fluttered in the steady coastal breeze. The recruits expected irritation. They expected him to defend himself. Instead, they got nothing. The absence of a reaction only fueled their determination. Human nature hated mysteries, especially young men convinced they already knew every answer. "Come on," Jason said. "You cannot just drop a line like that and act mysterious." Glenn looked at him for a long moment. His pale eyes carried no anger, no embarrassment, no desire to impress anyone. "Some things were never meant to be explained," he said quietly. The words landed with unexpected weight. For reasons Jason could not explain, they annoyed him even more. Nearby, Petty Officer Ryan Brooks continued watching. He had arrived 15 minutes earlier to inspect equipment inventory. Instead, he found himself observing a conversation that felt increasingly unusual. Something about Glenn's posture triggered distant memories. Ryan had spent 12 years in the Navy. He had met decorated veterans before. Admirals, chiefs, men with walls covered in awards. Yet none of them carried themselves quite like this. Glenn sat perfectly still while being mocked by a dozen younger men, and somehow it felt as though he was the only person present who was completely comfortable. Ryan studied the tattoo again. The serpent, the star. A strange feeling tugged at the edge of his memory. He had seen something similar before. Maybe in an archive photo. Maybe during a briefing years ago. He could not place it. Across the yard, Jason noticed Ryan staring. "You recognize it?" he asked loudly. Ryan hesitated. "Not exactly." Jason laughed. "That means no." The recruits chuckled again. One of them uploaded the photo into a private training group chat used by candidates and instructors. Within minutes, comments began appearing beneath it. Joke after joke. Guesses. Sarcasm. Someone compared it to a motorcycle club logo. Another claimed it looked like a faded amusement park sticker. The photo spread faster than anyone expected. Glenn never looked at a single screen. He simply sat there, watching the flags move in the wind. Then Ryan's phone vibrated. A message appeared from an instructor working in another building. Only 4 words. "Where did you find this?" Ryan stared at the screen. A second message arrived almost immediately. This time there was no humor attached. No emoji. No explanation. Just a direct request. "Send me the original photo now." Ryan felt a chill despite the growing heat of the morning. Slowly, he looked back toward Glenn Walker. For the first time, he began to suspect that the recruits had not discovered a joke. They had stumbled onto something else entirely. Ryan Brooks read the message twice before looking up from his phone. Around him, the rhythm of the training compound continued as if nothing had changed. Recruits jogged between stations. Instructors called out times and corrections. Somewhere beyond the buildings, a helicopter passed overhead, its distant rotor hum rolling across the coastal air. Yet the words on his screen refused to leave his mind. "Where did you find this?" It was not the message itself that bothered him. It was the sender. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hale was not a man who reacted quickly to anything. 20 years in naval special warfare had given him the calm temperament of someone who had already seen every surprise the world could offer. The fact that he had responded within seconds made Ryan uneasy. He forwarded the original image and slipped his phone back into his pocket. Across the yard, Jason Cole was still enjoying the attention. More recruits had gathered after seeing the photo circulate through the private group chat. The tattoo had become the unofficial entertainment of the morning. The theories grew more ridiculous by the minute. Some claimed it belonged to a forgotten motorcycle club. Others suggested it was an old camping organization. Every joke drew another round of laughter. Glenn Walker remained exactly where he had been. The paper coffee cup rested beside him now, nearly empty. His gaze stayed fixed on the training field, as though the conversation happening around him existed 1,000 miles away. The strange thing was that Ryan could not remember Glenn ever introducing himself. Nobody had asked his name until now. Nobody had seemed interested. The tattoo had become the story. The man wearing it had somehow become secondary. Then Ryan's phone vibrated again. This time the message contained only a single sentence. "Do not let him leave." Ryan frowned. His eyes narrowed. The request carried an unusual urgency. Before he could respond, another message arrived. "Is he still there?" Ryan looked toward Glenn again. The old veteran had not moved more than a few feet all morning. He sat quietly beneath the bright California sun, hands folded loosely together, looking less like a man at the center of growing attention and more like someone waiting for a bus. Ryan typed a quick reply confirming Glenn was still at the compound. 3 dots appeared instantly, then disappeared, then appeared again. Whatever was happening on the other side of that conversation seemed increasingly serious. Nearby, Jason noticed Ryan staring at his phone. "What is it?" he called. "Did somebody identify the mystery tattoo?" Several recruits laughed. Ryan forced a neutral expression. "Nothing confirmed." Jason smirked. "That is what I thought." But even as he said it, his confidence seemed slightly weaker than before. Curiosity had begun replacing amusement. Human beings could ignore a mystery for only so long before they wanted answers. 10 minutes later, a black government SUV rolled through the security gate at the far end of the compound. The vehicle moved steadily between rows of buildings before disappearing behind an administrative structure. Most recruits never noticed it. Ryan did. His stomach tightened immediately. Visitors with that level of access rarely arrived unannounced. His phone vibrated for a third time. He opened the message and felt the blood drain from his face. Chief Hale had finally responded. The text contained only 6 words. "Nobody jokes about that symbol." Ryan slowly lowered the phone. Beyond the obstacle course, Glenn Walker remained seated beneath the morning sun, calm and silent, while a wind off the Pacific stirred the edge of his sleeve. For the first time, Ryan realized that whatever story was attached to that faded tattoo was far bigger than anyone standing in the compound had imagined. The mood around the compound shifted in ways most of the recruits could not yet understand. The jokes continued, but they no longer carried the same confidence. A question had entered the room, and questions had a way of changing everything. Jason Cole felt it first. Not fear, not concern, just uncertainty. It was an unfamiliar feeling. He had spent months proving himself among other recruits, learning that confidence could solve almost any problem. Yet confidence was difficult to maintain when experienced professionals suddenly became cautious. He watched Ryan Brooks across the yard. The petty officer had stopped smiling altogether. That alone was strange. Ryan was respected throughout the compound for his calm demeanor and steady judgment. Seeing him unsettled made Jason feel as though he had missed something important. Glenn Walker remained seated beneath the bright sky. The old veteran appeared completely detached from the growing tension around him. A breeze rolled in from the Pacific, carrying the scent of salt and sun-warmed concrete. His sleeve shifted slightly against his forearm. The faded serpent tattoo appeared again. Jason stared at it longer this time. What had looked ridiculous earlier now seemed strangely deliberate. Every line, every curve, every inch of faded ink appeared intentional. Across the compound, Ryan's phone rang. Not a text, an actual call. He answered immediately. "Brooks." The voice on the other end was calm but direct. "Chief Marcus Hale." "Listen carefully." Ryan stepped farther away from the recruits. "Yes, Chief. Do not discuss that symbol with anyone." Ryan glanced toward Glenn. "Understood." A brief silence followed. Then the chief asked a question that made Ryan stop walking. "Has he said anything about where he got it?" Ryan looked back again. The old veteran sat quietly beside his empty coffee cup. "No, Chief." Another pause. "Good." Ryan frowned. "Good." Chief Hale lowered his voice. "Because if it is who I think it is, he would never tell you." The line went silent for several seconds. Ryan heard papers moving in the background. Distant voices. Then the chief spoke again. "There are things that happened before your generation entered the teams. Before mine too. Some stories never made it into books." Ryan swallowed. "What exactly am I looking at?" The answer came slowly. "I am not sure yet." The honesty surprised him. Marcus Hale was not a man known for uncertainty. "But I just received 3 phone calls from people who have not contacted me in years." Ryan felt his pulse quicken. Over a tattoo? Not the tattoo. The chief corrected him. The man wearing it. The call ended without another explanation. Ryan stood motionless beneath the afternoon sun. Nearby, the recruits continued speculating among themselves, unaware that the conversation had already expanded far beyond their training compound. Hundreds of miles away, the photograph was moving through channels few of them even knew existed. Jason noticed Ryan returning. "Well," he called out, "did you get your answer?" Ryan looked directly at him. For a moment it seemed as though he wanted to say something. Then he simply shook his head. "No." Jason smirked. "That is what I thought." Yet the response felt weaker now. Forced. Because even Jason could see something had changed. The old veteran had not defended himself. He had not explained himself. And somehow, without doing either, he had become the most important person on the entire base. Glenn finally stood. Slowly, calmly. The movement drew every eye nearby. He picked up his empty cup and glanced toward the distant water beyond the training grounds. For the briefest moment, sunlight caught the faded ink on his forearm. Ryan watched carefully. The symbol seemed ordinary, almost forgettable. Yet somewhere beyond the horizon, people with decades of service behind them were reacting as if they had just seen a ghost. Glenn Walker took only a few steps before stopping near a weathered wooden railing overlooking the far edge of the compound. Beyond it, the Pacific shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, endless and bright. The recruits continued watching him, though most could not explain why. The old veteran rested one hand against the railing. His fingers brushed the faded serpent on his forearm. The moment felt small, ordinary. Yet for Glenn, the touch opened a door that had remained closed for decades. The sounds of the training compound faded. The distant voices disappeared. The salt air changed. Suddenly he was young again. Not 82. Not retired. Just a lean man standing beneath a moonless sky with four others whose names still lived in his memory. There were no cameras. No ceremonies. No reporters. Only darkness stretching across miles of open water and the steady rhythm of waves against a remote shoreline. The mission itself had long since vanished from official conversation. Time had buried details beneath layers of silence. But Glenn still remembered the faces. Daniel Mercer with his crooked grin. Thomas Reed, who could navigate by stars alone. Victor Hayes, who never wasted a word. Michael Donovan, whose calm voice could settle any room. 5 men. 5 shadows moving through uncertainty together. They were young enough to believe they would live forever and experienced enough to know they would not. The memory drifted forward. Glenn saw a small campfire hidden from view, its glow barely visible against the darkness. The mission was over. Not because anyone declared it complete. Not because anyone handed out awards. It was over because they had all come back. Sometimes that was enough. The 5 men sat together in silence. No speeches. No celebrations. Just the quiet relief of shared understanding. Then Daniel reached into his pack and produced a folded piece of paper. On it was a rough sketch. A serpent forming a circle around a simple star. The drawing was imperfect, the lines uneven. Yet every man around the fire understood it instantly. The serpent represented continuity, loyalty without end. The star represented the 5 of them. 5 points, 5 names, 5 lives permanently connected by experiences no one outside their circle would ever fully understand. Nobody ordered the symbol. Nobody approved it. Nobody recorded it. That was precisely why it mattered. Over the following days, each man carried the mark. Not as decoration. Not as recognition. As a promise. A reminder that history books often miss the most important stories. Years passed. Careers ended. Life scattered them across the country. Some became instructors. Some disappeared into quiet civilian lives. One opened a fishing charter business in Florida. Another spent years volunteering with veterans. They rarely spoke about the symbol. They never needed to. The meaning traveled with them. The memory shifted again. Glenn saw himself decades later standing alone in a cemetery beneath gray clouds. Then another funeral years after that. The circle slowly becoming smaller. 5 stars becoming 4. Then 3. Then 2. Through it all, the serpent remained on his arm. Faded. Weathered. Aging alongside him. The ocean breeze returned. The memory dissolved. Glenn blinked and found himself standing once more at the edge of the training compound. The recruits were still watching. The Pacific still sparkled beyond the fence line. The tattoo remained exactly where it had always been. But far away, in offices and conference rooms scattered across the military community, phones continued ringing. Names continued being mentioned. Questions continued spreading. And for the first time in many years, people who remembered the old symbol were beginning to realize that one of the last men carrying it was standing in plain sight. Petty Officer Ryan Brooks felt the tension tighten as Glenn Walker moved toward the center of the compound. The sun reflected off the blacktop in shifting patterns, and the distant hum of a helicopter seemed to slow in perception, as if the world itself had paused to take notice. Recruits whispered among themselves, unsure why their laughter had died down and why curiosity had taken the place of their previous amusement. Jason Cole shifted on his feet, sensing the change without fully understanding it. The old veteran stopped briefly to adjust the cuff of his faded olive jacket, revealing more of the serpentine tattoo, the details still crisp enough to draw the eye and yet softened by age. Each recruit unconsciously straightened, as if the movement of the man in front of them demanded attention, even before any word was spoken. Ryan moved closer, keeping his gaze fixed on Glenn, noting the way the wind played across the tattoo, the subtle shift of light highlighting curves and lines in ways that made the symbol feel almost alive. It was not the artistry of ink that impressed him, but the story it suggested, the invisible weight of years and silent experience compressed into a simple mark. Across the compound, Jason whispered something to his neighbor, his words drowned by the faint breeze carrying the distant clang of training equipment. He wanted to break the silence, to regain control of the moment, but even he could not bring himself to speak. Glenn's eyes, pale and steady, scanned the recruits slowly, deliberately, as if measuring their intent and their understanding simultaneously. There was a calm power in his gaze that required no demonstration, no voice, no authority other than presence itself. Ryan's phone vibrated briefly in his pocket. Another message. It was from an instructor stationed in a building nearby, and the single line of text read, "Command viewing." Glenn continues. Ryan's pulse quickened. He glanced around to confirm no other instructor was interfering, and then he returned his focus to the veteran. The recruits, sensing that something significant was about to happen, stopped their chatter entirely. Even the wind seemed quieter as Glenn took another step, the movement deliberate, controlled, and measured. He reached the edge of the training field, and the sunlight reflected off his bald temple, the shadow of his profile stretching long across the ground. Every recruit followed his motion with an intensity they did not understand. Glenn raised his head slightly, and his gaze aligned with the far end of the compound where a black SUV had recently appeared. The vehicle door opened. Figures in dark uniforms stepped out and began moving with purposeful precision. The presence was unmistakable. The energy in the air shifted, dense and focused. Ryan's hands tightened around his phone as he observed the unfolding scene. He understood that the photograph circulating earlier had triggered a chain of events far beyond the compound's normal operations. Glenn's tattoo caught the sun once more, and the light reflected in a way that seemed to punctuate the silent command in the air. The recruits, still frozen in place, began to realize that their morning entertainment had become part of something larger, a revelation that would remain unspoken until its proper moment. The veteran stood quietly, motionless yet commanding, the serpentine symbol on his forearm capturing the attention of everyone who mattered without a single word, preparing the stage for authority to emerge and for the silence of recognition to speak louder than any explanation ever could. The black SUV came to a stop near the administrative building, and for several seconds nobody stepped forward. The engine went silent. The compound seemed to hold its breath. Jason Cole watched from across the training field, trying to convince himself that the arrival had nothing to do with the old veteran. Yet the timing felt impossible to ignore. Around him, the recruits had fallen into an uneasy silence. Even the instructors appeared distracted, their attention drifting toward the vehicle. Petty Officer Ryan Brooks felt his phone vibrate again. This time the message came from Chief Marcus Hale himself. For words. He is coming personally. Ryan stared at the screen. For a moment he wondered if he had misunderstood. Men at that level did not alter their schedules because of an old photograph. They certainly did not travel across a base on short notice unless something demanded immediate attention. Ryan slipped the phone into his pocket and looked toward Glenn Walker. The veteran remained completely composed. No anticipation, no nervousness, no sign that anything unusual was happening. He simply stood near the railing, watching the ocean beyond the compound as sunlight danced across the water. The faded serpent tattoo rested against his forearm, ordinary to anyone who did not know its history. Then the rear door of the SUV opened. A tall figure stepped out wearing a dark uniform. Every instructor nearby recognized him instantly. Commander Michael Kane. Conversation stopped. The effect was immediate and automatic. Kane was not merely respected. He was one of those leaders whose presence changed the atmosphere of an entire room before he spoke a single word. Jason felt his stomach tighten. He had seen the commander only twice before. Neither occasion had been casual. Yet what happened next made even the instructors exchange confused glances. Commander Kane did not head toward headquarters. He did not acknowledge the staff waiting near the building. He ignored the administrative offices entirely. Instead, he began walking directly across the training grounds, straight toward Glenn Walker. The distance was nearly 100 yards. Every step seemed deliberate, purposeful. Recruits instinctively moved aside as he approached. No orders were given. None were needed. Ryan noticed something else. Kane was not alone. Two senior officers had emerged from the vehicle behind him. Both followed silently. Neither attempted conversation. Their expressions carried the same unusual seriousness. Jason glanced around. The confidence that had fueled the morning's jokes was gone now. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody even smiled. The closer the commander came, the heavier the silence became. Glenn finally turned from the ocean. His pale blue eyes settled on the approaching figure. For the first time all day, a faint expression crossed his face. Not surprise. Recognition. It lasted only a second before disappearing again. Commander Kane continued forward without slowing. The wind tugged gently at his uniform. Sunlight reflected off polished insignia. His gaze never left the old veteran. Ryan could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. Years of service had taught him how to read people, and everything about the commander's posture communicated one unmistakable fact. This was not a courtesy visit. This was not curiosity. This was respect. Deep respect. The kind earned over a lifetime. Jason swallowed hard as realization began creeping into his thoughts. The tattoo, the phone calls, the messages, the sudden arrival. None of it had been a coincidence. Somewhere along the way, the recruits had stopped being observers and become witnesses to something much larger than themselves. Commander Kane closed the final 20 yards. The compound stood silent beneath the bright California sky. Every eye followed him. Every recruit watched. Every instructor waited. And as the commander reached Glenn Walker and came to a stop directly in front of him, the entire base seemed to freeze, suspended between the mystery that had brought them here and the revelation that was finally about to unfold. Commander Michael Kane stopped less than 3 feet from Glenn Walker. Neither man spoke at first. The wind moved gently across the training grounds, carrying the distant scent of salt water from the Pacific. Around them, dozens of recruits stood frozen in place. Instructors remained silent. Even the 2 senior officers who had arrived with the commander seemed content to let the moment unfold on its own. Glenn looked up calmly. His expression did not change. There was no surprise in his eyes. No confusion. Only the quiet recognition of someone seeing a familiar face after many years. Commander Kane held his gaze for several seconds. Then his eyes lowered briefly toward the faded serpent tattoo resting against Glenn's forearm. Something shifted in the commander's expression. It was subtle, almost impossible to detect unless someone was looking closely. The hard edges of command softened. The formal posture remained, but beneath it appeared something much deeper. Respect. Genuine respect. Jason Cole felt his mouth go dry. He had expected questions. Maybe an introduction. Perhaps some explanation that would finally make sense of the day's events. Instead, the commander did something nobody anticipated. Slowly and deliberately, he came to attention. The movement was precise. Perfect. Years of discipline condensed into a single motion. The entire training compound seemed to stop breathing. Glenn remained still. The sunlight reflected across the faded ink on his arm. Commander Kane raised his hand. A formal salute. Absolute silence followed. No one spoke. No one moved. For several heartbeats, the only sound was the distant cry of seabirds drifting over the coastline. Jason stared in disbelief. He had spent months training under instructors who rarely offered praise and almost never displayed ceremony outside official occasions. Yet here stood one of the most respected leaders on the base, saluting a man who had arrived carrying nothing more than an old coffee cup and a faded tattoo. The meaning struck him like a physical weight. Whatever he had assumed about Glenn Walker had been completely wrong. Ryan Brooks felt a chill travel through him despite the afternoon heat. He had served long enough to understand what a salute represented. It was not admiration. It was not courtesy. It was recognition. Recognition earned through sacrifice, service, and character. Commander Kane held the salute for several seconds before lowering his hand. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet enough that everyone strained to hear. "It is an honor to see you again, sir." The words landed harder than any speech could have. Glenn gave a small nod. Nothing more. No dramatic reaction. No attempt to draw attention to himself. The simplicity of it somehow made the moment even more powerful. The two senior officers behind the commander exchanged brief glances before stepping forward. Without hesitation, they also came to attention. Then they saluted. A ripple moved through the instructors standing nearby. One after another, experienced men who understood exactly what they were witnessing followed suit. Across the compound, recruits looked around in stunned silence as the wave spread outward. Nobody issued an order. Nobody demanded compliance. Yet respect traveled through the formation naturally, carried by understanding. Jason felt his heart pounding. The jokes from earlier echoed in his memory, each one sounding smaller and more foolish than the last. Glenn Walker stood quietly at the center of it all, saying almost nothing, asking for nothing, while an entire chain of leadership acknowledged him without hesitation. The faded serpent tattoo remained visible beneath the California sun. It had not changed. The symbol was exactly the same as it had been that morning. The difference was that now everyone understood they had been looking at it the wrong way. It was never the tattoo itself that mattered. It was the life behind it. And standing before them was a man whose story carried a weight that even the highest-ranking people on the base could not ignore. The compound remained silent long after the chain of salutes ended. The sun had shifted higher in the sky, casting long, bright reflections off the asphalt and railings. Recruits remained frozen where they stood, their earlier laughter replaced by a mixture of awe and confusion. Jason Cole finally exhaled slowly, realizing that nothing he had witnessed would fit into any of his prior assumptions about authority or experience. Petty Officer Ryan Brooks watched carefully, his instincts honed over years of service telling him this was not the end, merely a pause in a story that extended far beyond the base. Glenn Walker stood quietly, his posture relaxed but every movement deliberate, each breath measured as if he alone controlled the passage of time in this small corner of California. The tattoo on his forearm caught the sun again, a faint shimmer that seemed almost symbolic now, a quiet monument to experiences the recruits would never fully grasp. Commander Michael Kane stepped back, his salute complete but his presence lingering, the respect in his eyes unmistakable. The two senior officers mirrored the commander's movements, their attention unwavering, acknowledging the depth of history contained within a single individual. Around them, instructors slowly regained composure, nodding to one another as if silently agreeing that the morning had revealed a truth about service, honor, and recognition far beyond formal orders or medals. The recruits began to murmur softly, but their voices lacked certainty. Each was processing the realization that Glenn Walker's quiet demeanor and faded tattoo carried more weight than any display of authority they had encountered in their short careers. The sound of distant helicopters, previously ordinary, now seemed subdued, as though even the machines recognized the significance of what had unfolded. Glenn adjusted his jacket and exhaled deeply, the faint smell of the Pacific air filling his senses. For decades, he had carried the memory of missions that were never recorded, of men whose names had faded with time, of promises kept silently among a small circle of comrades. Now, standing in plain sight, he realized that recognition could arrive without fanfare, without explanation, simply through the acknowledgement of those who understood. Jason shifted uncomfortably, aware that the morning had changed him in ways he did not yet comprehend. The chain of command, the private jokes, the casual arrogance of youth, all had been reframed by a single, quiet figure. Commander Kane and the officers withdrew slightly, maintaining respect but allowing Glenn the space he had always commanded naturally. The recruits watched, learning a lesson in humility and observation, understanding that sometimes the greatest authority was not claimed but earned silently, over decades of dedication. Glenn took one final step toward the railing, pausing to look out over the Pacific, his face calm, resolute. He did not speak. He did not gesture. His story was not for explanation. It existed in the silence, in the subtle acknowledgement of those who knew its value. And as the sun continued to climb, casting long golden reflections across the compound, everyone present, recruits, instructors, officers, understood that respect had been delivered quietly, without proclamation, leaving a lingering awareness that some legacies did not need words. The serpent and star on his forearm remained, unassuming yet infinitely significant, a reminder that true honor often resided in the unspoken, and that some salutes truly lasted a lifetime.